watching an inbound marketing show to help you land more whales.
I'm Josh, the HubSpot expert.
And I'm Holly, the niche inbound strategy expert. We
work at Protocol 80, an inbound marketing agency located in Lewis Run, PA, which is just outside of Bradford, PA.
Which is where?
About an hour and a half south of Buffalo.
Cool. Middle of nowhere.
Yes. We work with contract manufacturers, OEMs, and B2B healthcare companies, helping them generate new leads and close more sales, ideally some whales.
Yeah. And if you're here, you're in the right place if you're a sales, service, or marketing pro looking for inbound strategy advice. If you're having issues driving traffic, converting leads, closing deals, just managing marketing in general, we're here to help.
Last month we talked about ROI, or return on investment, so if that's something that's important for you to understand a little bit more, I'd recommend going back and watching episode 10.
10, yep. Yeah. So this month we're going to dive into onboarding. Going into the new year, you might be considering onboarding some new tactics, either in-house or with an agency, and onboarding can be a little rough. So we thought we would offer some advice, best practices for onboarding efficiently.
It can be a little rough, but it's super important. I think it's one of those things where people are super excited, you got momentum going, you're ready to get into it, and then onboarding happens, and you're like, well, it just doesn't feel like we're progressing, but it's really great progress. And like I said, super important.
If you set a shitty foundation, your house falls down.
Yeah.
And onboarding is your foundation setting. So
that's right.
It's like the most important thing you do.
Right. When you look at a home and you look at the foundation, you're like, this is boring. But wait until you start hanging tchotchkes off the wall.
Enough talking around. Let's set sail.
All right. So I've got some questions that I have worked very hard to prepare for you.
Okay.
Around onboarding.
Okay.
My first one is when you're onboarding a new marketing strategy or sales strategy, either way, regardless of whether it's in-house or an agency, who should be at the table so that they are a part of it?
Yes. I think going from the top down, you definitely need stakeholders who are there, anyone who's going to be barking up someone's tree if they don't feel like marketing investment is used correctly, if they have some type of buy-in or stake that they're holding in how the marketing is performing. It's really important that they're there, that they're understanding the tactics that are being deployed, or else that just leads to confusion down the line. It's also really important that anyone whose insight might need to be a part of the process. So sometimes for us that looks like bringing in engineers, product managers from our client's team. Specifically if you're doing something like inbound, they might need to be kind of that resource provider for these technical blogs and things. And then of course sales and marketing. It's really important to have anyone who will be supporting those efforts in-house or working with the agency there in that meeting as well. Obviously that should be a no-brainer hopefully, but yeah, making sure that you have all of those other people there as well. Pretty much anyone who gives a crap about marketing should at least be in those initial onboarding phases.
Sure. I like that, and I fully agree.
Cool.
Would you like me to ask my next question, or do you want to ask a question?
Well, I actually had the same question prepared for you from the sales side of things. Like if you're onboarding a new sales initiative or maybe even a software, a new CRM tool, who needs to be a part of that conversation?
I think, some of the same groups of people. Your sales team definitely should be involved as much as possible. They're the ones that are hearing questions often. They're the ones that are going to be, if it's a sales strategy, specifically deploying some of those efforts that are put out there. I think some of the other people that would be valuable to have would be, and this kind of is going to vary by the type of business you are and the structure of your business.
Sure.
But, customer service people, potentially engineers, or if you're thinking in the SaaS world, people that are the developer engineering type.
Right.
The ones that understand the feature set, those people would be helpful to be involved. Again, the stakeholders, the CEOs. If you have a separate team of outside sales and inside sales, and they are doing different things, maybe talking about different types of problems, questions, solutions, it would be ideal to have both of those teams involved, even if one or the other isn't necessarily involved in deployment.
That makes sense.
But kind of the same answer. Like if you're involved or you have a stake, that you're holding, you should be at least part of some of them. You don't
Right.
necessarily have to be there for all of them. You don't need like an all-hands meeting every onboarding
Right.
meeting or onboarding discussion.
Right. Definitely, I think the important ones would be like goal setting, anything like that that's talking about what success looks like. It's really important that anyone who has a hand in success is there for that. And then that initial kind of, hey, here's how we're planning on working. This is probably more specific to like agency life. Like, hey, here's a little bit about us, how we work, how we bill, how, we determine success, what our cadence is, like all of that kind of stuff. And then something that we include in our onboarding that I think is nice is questions about what red flags look like for both teams. And so that's really important to hear from anyone who might look at that red flag and, be freaking out, because then sooner rather than later what that means to them.
Sure. I think you bring up a good point about the goal setting, because that's something that you absolutely want full alignment on. Everyone's expectations and understanding of what those expectations are is important. You don't want to be going down two different paths and then 6 months down the road find out that you were trying to achieve something different.
Definitely. And I think a challenge too is sometimes, not always, but sometimes some stakeholders or some people who are a little bit less involved in the day-to-day will set goals that the implementers or the team who's actually deploying the strategy know aren't necessarily achievable. And if they're not candid and forward, or even if they're in the room when those goals are set, to say like, well, I was expecting 10,000 MQLs or something like that, then that doesn't give the deployment team a chance to be like, whoa, hang on a minute. So it's really important that all of that is kind of cleared and assessed up front.
Great. So I think that was your question. I'll go to another one. So I mentioned earlier that onboarding can be one of those things where you've got this momentum going, but then it feels like you kind of hit a brick wall, even though you haven't.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you would look to do or accomplish maybe while onboarding is happening that could kind of start turning some of those wheels or keep that excitement going from the internal teams that maybe you had to convince the buy-in from, that this should be something we should be doing?
Yeah. I think it largely depends on what motivates that team. So it can look like a couple different things, but one thing that can be really helpful is giving them documents that help them get excited. So an example of that could be like a really in-depth competitor audit, a really in-depth SEO audit, like something tangible where they're like, yes, numbers, I can see what other people are doing. A lot of times, specifically if you're onboarding with new software and new marketing tools that help you look at things you've never been able to see before, just being forthright with those and handing those off and saying like, here, look at what your competitors are doing, that can be really exciting, and also help get the gears turning in terms of content. So that's one thing, is just, I think a mistake sometimes marketers make is just gathering all of this data and information and auditing and just kind of keeping that and assuming the client wouldn't care to see kind of how the sausage is made. I found that that's not necessarily true. A lot of those documents can be really exciting and keep that momentum going. Another thing is building in some time for quick wins that don't require strategy. So for some clients, this could be as easy as like, oh my God, you don't have a form on your site. Let's build you an RFQ page and a way to gather leads right now. For some clients, that can be like, oh, you've been blogging for 10 years. There's probably some really good content in there that we can start to re-optimize and touch up with modern day SEO practices, new algorithms in mind, really quick wins like that that don't take a ton of time from the marketing team, but are still kind of moving the needle and starting to work behind the scenes. So I guess it just sort of depends on if the stakeholders and the people that you're working with are really driven by like facts and numbers and strategy, or if they're driven by like doing results and accomplishing things, hitting the publish button. You could really go either way with that, or a combination of both.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want me to ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay.
I see that you have yours written down.
Yes.
I have
Don't
mine
look at them,
from my
please.
memory.
Can you pinpoint an ideal timeline for onboarding? Both marketing, sales, anything. Like, is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? Is it 1 month? Is it 65 days?
That's a hard question. I think there's some variables as to the complexity of the strategy. I think what's important is that you don't rush it.
Right.
A typical onboarding, if we're onboarding a team for a full inbound marketing strategy, is going to be roughly 2 to 3 months for a marketing strategy onboarding. That would be, research, identification of competitors, planning, buyer persona workshops, journey workshops, interviews, all that stuff. It takes time. It takes time not only to perform, but it also takes time from the team to be involved in those as well. It's not like you can necessarily set aside an entire week of everyone's time to say, hey, we're going to do this.
Yeah, definitely.
And walk out standing at the end,
Yeah.
because it'd be a big challenge. So then, we also could be looking at a potential like technical onboarding.
Right.
So let's say a HubSpot onboarding. When I look at that and I define an onboarding, that would be, getting the tools set up, customizing for the team, testing, training, data import and setup and all of that. A typical HubSpot onboarding, if we're looking at something that's a little bit complex, could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending on what they're coming from, how long the overlap is. So those two things I think are going to be variables. You're doing two different things there. And then from a sales strategy onboarding, again, I think that depends on how many teams you're training, what the structure of those teams are, maybe the approach that people are doing right now, how similar they are between different reps, different teams, and whether there's a defined process that these sales teams are following. I think if you have to work backwards, kind of define that process, build that process out, and then build a strategy around that, I think you're looking at a more comprehensive, longer onboarding.
Of course.
If it's as simple as, we've got some new assets that we're giving, some new tools that we're giving you could onboard something like that pretty quickly, maybe a month or two.
Right, definitely. I think something that we sometimes see people balk at kind of being like, yep, it's 3 months before we really get started doing anything. And sometimes, unfortunately, that 3 can turn into like 6 or even more if, both teams aren't prepared and ready to go. So I think there's a little bit too of, like you mentioned, tool setup, both from a CRM perspective, but also just from like an analytics perspective, can be really arduous if people don't come prepared and have the stuff that they need. So we're in November right now. If you're looking on like onboarding an agency, working with someone into the new year, now would be the time to start to gather some of that stuff that you probably haven't thought about in a really long time, like access to your website. That is sometimes something that someone built 5 years ago and no one has access to anymore. That's something we're going to need. Analytics, Search Console, anything like that, your CRM, anything that we can have access to just helps us move quicker. And unfortunately, if it hasn't been touched in a long time, sometimes that kind of stuff is hard to find, and that can sometimes just screech the brakes to a halt in the middle of onboarding if we don't have access to see that type of stuff.
Sure. Yeah, if you're working with a marketing agency, they will be pleasantly surprised if you bring all of that stuff to the table and get them access quickly.
Yeah.
So my next question is around focus. So there's so many times where we talk about onboarding or start onboarding, whether it's buyer persona specific, and you look at the organization and who they sell to and the people involved, the stakeholders involved, understand that they sell to different groups of people, different types of people, different levels at the organization of their prospects. Mm-hmm. How do you get everyone to focus in so you're not trying to create a strategy that is touching everyone that might be involved?
So I try and always ask the questions about like, what's the highest value? So something that we're embarking on, not a new client, but into the new year, is focusing on a client who serves like multiple distinct and separate industries, and focusing on doing one per quarter and really just honing in on those efforts. And the questions that we asked to decide where to start out of these 8 different industries was like, which has the highest value? Like if you win a deal, what is the most exciting? Like where, like, what's the biggest lifetime value? Those types of things. And that can be hard, as you're saying, with like, if they have multiple personas, it's like, well, it's all valuable. What have we historically seen success in? What tends to be our easiest foot through the door? Like where can we work smarter, not harder, kind of? And if there's a persona that is historically more online, well, maybe we start there, learn what we can about those businesses, about that persona, and then go into something that might be a little bit more difficult. I'm all about reducing friction and not making anything unnecessarily hard. So I think working with what you've had in the past, like success that you've had, is a really good way to kind of focus things in, highest value, highest past successes. That's not to say don't ever try something new, but if everything's important, that can be a great way to start. And also see success quicker, which makes it a little bit easier to get buy-in to do something more complicated that might have a longer ramp time.
Sure, and some of those other things can come later on.
Yes. Something too is building your focus in a way where, like, you don't have to just focus on one thing. Like, you can have a primary persona, but there's certain like baselines that you can still cover for all of your personas before you dive into heavily promoting one. So that was like a lot of word jumble, but what I mean by that is like making sure that your website pages are fleshed out and talk to all of these personas, and then pick one to really like blog for. So it's not like we're just going to pick one and then you're never going to see a mention of these other ones at all or any resources for them. There can still be infrastructure in place that supports those other personas where they can still find things. The effort just might not be as robust there.
Sure. I would like to lean towards probably that champion, that internal champion that's going to drive internally on their side, fight for you. And then if I were to pick a second one, it would be the decision maker. So then you still have those kind of people in between that you could potentially create other types of assets or modify those assets.
Exactly.
Later on.
And you can still do, there's little like quick win, again, things that you can do, like sales could be working on an ABM campaign, nurturing one persona, and if there's already assets created and things, marketing could be focusing on a different persona. Like, that's fully possible. So,
cool.
Yeah.
That was my question.
Okay. What are some areas do you think companies can improve their internal onboarding? So say that they've decided they're going with a new CRM or they've just hired a new marketing person. Where do you see there's room for improvement commonly?
I would say commonly it's just about the communication as to what they're doing, why they're doing it, and some of the expectations. I think that so many times something's being deployed, whether it's a new piece of technology or a strategy of some sort, the people that are driving that explain that we're doing this, but they don't kind of give that other insight as to why it's important that they follow through and make sure that it's successful. I think that that information needs to be clearly stated so that there's not assumptions as to why you're doing something.
Right.
There's just so many levels of disconnect and poor communication around those types of things. That hands down could be the number one improvement, and get buy-in from everyone across the board that's going to be touching this effort, whatever it may be.
Absolutely.
Either early on or way down the road. And speaking of that, it would be something that you would want to probably reiterate over time, not just say it on day one and then never talk about it again.
Exactly. I think something that helps with that too, in that communication, is creating things like roadmaps that are very clear for everyone to see, onboarding and then through execution, that are like, okay, we know this is a lot, we know we have 3 months here potentially of a lot of work we're going to be doing, this is what that looks like, this is how it's broken down, this is what we're going to accomplish each week, each month, this is when it'll be done, so that you can gauge that progress is being made, instead of like hearing from this marketing person once who's like, I'm going to build these personas, and it's like, okay, that takes usually 3 weeks, iterating on what goes into that, checking that box and saying, okay, I've done my interviews, okay, I've done that, you know what I mean, and showing that behind the scenes, I think, can be helpful with that communication.
Cool. My next question, kind of a fun one, maybe not.
Okay.
Maybe it will cause nightmares. Any horror stories, onboarding horror stories that you can share over your life of onboarding many clients?
I don't even know where to begin. I'm trying to think of where to begin, so that we're not here all day. I'm trying to think of the most horrific one. We had a client once, and we can cut this, I guess, if we don't want to talk about it, that we onboarded. And it felt like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where we would have goal-setting conversations, and we would talk through the pathway to get there, and the whole marketing support team would be there. So like a handful of their engineers, their sales team, a marketing person, I think, and then, you know, their key stakeholder. And we would get on the phone and like set all these tones and see that everything was okay. And then like the next day we'd get emails that were like, why are we doing this? Where are we going? Like, what's going on? Like, I hate you. And I mean, that's how it felt. That's not literally what
That was
they
just
said.
personal, though.
Yeah, those were only to me, not our team as a whole. And I think at the root of that was sort of if there was trepidation on calls or not a full understanding of where we were going, instead of asking those questions on the call, they would kind of wait until we were doing something or wait until they saw the final deliverable and then be like, I hate this. And I think that came from just not communicating or things being a priority that we didn't know were a priority and not saying that up front. So I think that that was definitely horrific because it felt like everything was going well and then we'd get an email and it was like, oh my god, this person hates me.
Learning experience though, right?
Mm-hmm. So that, to make that into a learning experience, is we changed the way that we ask questions during the sales process and then during really early onboarding to try and suss out some of those issues. And we've never had a situation like that again, so I think we were able to kind of take that and improve the way that we communicate, and that's really when we did start to communicate every single little thing and directly what needle that moves as well, which I think is helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was horrific. That was a horrific onboarding. Yeah. Do you want more? I could do this all day.
No, that was my question.
What about you? Do you recall a really arduous onboarding? Would it be the same as mine?
I love everyone and all things, so. I would say I don't really have any specific horror stories that come to mind, but we've been doing this for such a long time. You know, I think our processes early on were not very defined. And I think that those, in any situation, not having a process is going to be a horror story in itself, and it's just going to repeat the same mistakes over and over. So in going through that and learning from that and understanding we have to have a solid onboarding process, I think was important. So
definitely.
If you are an agency type or maybe a sales strategist or something, certainly have a process in place.
Yeah, I think this is something I always struggle with the sales process and strategy and onboarding is like sometimes it can feel like this endless chicken and egg loop. Like, I can't do this until I know this. How do I set their goals without knowing? Like, you know what I mean? Where it's like, so what we've done is we sort of have like an onboarding package of the things that we know need to happen, and then through conversation with someone, we adjust from that if something isn't relevant. And I think that's been incredibly helpful to have, like, okay, we know this set of activities drive success. We can definitely be flexible with this, but this is what's at the core. If someone needs a little extra or doesn't need something, and I think that's just helpful because it gives us a starting point. Instead of every single thing being brand new, it's like, okay, well, we always do these things and this always works. Yeah. And I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, agree.
I love us. Such a good agency.
Great.
People should work with us.
They should. I agree. Do you have any other questions?
I don't. Those were all my questions for you. Some of them were duplicates of the ones you asked me.
So, Holly.
So, Josh.
Now that we just talked about onboarding, what are your main takeaways?
Well, I've learned that it's really important to communicate. Basically, like, there's no such thing as over communication when it comes to onboarding in terms of what your goals are, what you're doing, what your trepidations are. Like, if you're not sure about something, voice that instead of letting someone go through a whole process and then saying, like, oh, by the way, I hated this. Those are kind of my main takeaways. What about you?
Well, I stated this, so I'm kind of stealing one of my own statements as my main takeaway.
Okay.
Have a process for everything.
Yeah.
Regardless of technology onboarding, marketing onboarding, sales onboarding, it's going to help people stay on track.
Yep.
In both parties. So it's going to help whoever's deploying to stay on track, and then whoever is
holding stakes.
They're going to be staying on track and knowing what the expectations are throughout the onboarding process.
Absolutely.
So those are my main takeaways.
And that's our show. Whale Watching airs the third Thursday of every month in 2021. Our next show airs December 16th at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern. This is our last episode of Whale Watching on Bright Talk. So if you want to catch it live on December 16th, this is the last time to like host a viewing party, cook some snacks. If someone was to cook a snack and watch Whale Watching, what do you think they should make?
Baked brie.
Okay.
So then, that's our show.
We'll see you next time.